This is Dr. Maria. Hope you guys are fine. Today we are going to study about the parturition, which means the birth of the baby, and it is characterized by a strong rhythmical contraction of the uterus until the baby is expelled. Now it is regulated by a certain hormonal and mechanical factors. First we'll see the hormonal factors. Number one is the estrogen to the progesterone ratio. As we know, the progesterone, it basically inhibits the uterus from the contracting throughout the pregnancy, but at the end of the pregnancy or when it reaches the term, the level of estrogen start increasing as compared to the progesterone, so it causes the more contraction of the uterus, one step towards the parturition. Second is the oxytocin. Whenever this contraction of the uterus, it causes the baby to move towards the cervix, and it applies the pressure on the cervix, which through the neurogenic reflexes causes the release of oxytocin. And oxytocin is a hormone which causes the contraction of the uterus. So more oxytocin is released, more contraction. Another factor is increased receptors of the oxytocin in the uterus, so it again expedites the activity of the oxytocin, and it causes the more contraction of the uterus, which will lead to the expulsion later on. Then also the fetal oxytocins and prostaglandins and cortisol, they also causes the contraction of the uterus and eventually expulsion of the baby. Some mechanical factors are also involved, like there is a stretch of the cervix and the stretch of the uterine muscles. As these are all smooth muscles, and you know the smooth muscle is also stimulated by the stretch, so whenever there is a pressure or there is a contraction, then there is a pressure on the smooth muscle, and it causes the contraction of the uterus and the cervical musculature, and then again it leads to the more pressure generation, which will leads to the more contraction. So this is how it is regulated. The next is the labor. It is basically a physiological process from the start of the contraction of the uterus till the baby is expelled, and it is has have certain contraction in the contraction of the labor we call as the Braxton Hicks contraction, though they are present throughout the pregnancy, but before the term or before the delivery they are dissipated due to different hormonal factors, though at the with the start of the labor they become stronger and stronger with passage of the time, and these contractions are known as the Braxton Hicks contractions. We divide the labor into the three stages: first, second, and third stage of the labor. The first stage of the labor, it starts from the contraction of the labor of the contraction of the uterus and the start of the labor till there is a full dilatation of the cervix, which is 10 centimeter. Here you can see at the start the head, it is not exactly effaced with the birth canal or with the cervix, then it is a fully effaced, and the cervix starts dilating. Here you can see it is 1 centimeter dilated, then it starts increasing, and eventually it becomes 10 centimeter dilated or fully dilated. Now the time taken by the first stage of the labor is different for a multiparous or a uniparous woman. Usually in the first pregnancy it takes maybe 12 hours or sometimes 24 hours for the first stage of the labor to be completed, and in second or third pregnancies it takes less time. We can divide the first stage into the two further phases, which is the latent phase and the active phase. Latent phase is still the 3 centimeter dilatation, and the active stage is still the 10 centimeter dilatation. Then we have the second stage of the labor. It starts from the full dilatation of the cervix, and it ends with the expulsion of the fetus from the birth canal. It again has two phases, propulsive and expulsive phase. In its propulsive phase, the uterus start contracting, and it is causes the baby to move towards the pelvic floor, and the usually the main part which is to be effaced, usually it is a head of the baby which gets locked and which attaches to the pelvic into the cervix, and then there is expulsion, which is distinguished by maternal bearing down efforts and end with the delivery of the baby. Usually the baby presents through the head, but in some cases the buttocks are presented. In this case we call it as the breech presentation. Now there is a positive feedback mechanism which causes this first and second stage to complete it effectively. It is this: whenever there is a stretching of the cervix, it causes the uterus to the contract. How does it occur? Due to the Braxton Hicks contraction, they causes the uterus to contract, and they move the baby, the head of the baby, or if whatever the presenting part, towards the cervix. So there is more pressure on the cervix. The nervous signals causes the brain to release oxytocin. As I've already discussed, the oxytocin, it causes the contraction of the uterus. So uterus contracts more, it further causes the movement of the presenting part of the baby, which is usually head, towards the cervix. Again there is stretching of the cervix, and again it sends more signals back to the brain and causes the release of more oxytocin. So more oxytocin again, more uterine contraction, more pressure towards the cervix, more stretching of the cervix, and so on. So due to this positive feedback mechanism, the first and the second stage of the labor, it causes the contraction. At the start, usually the contraction, there is a gap of around 30 minutes. Though later on the gap, it decreases because more oxytocin is released, there is more contraction, so it gap can be usually 3 contractions per 10 minutes. Now this gap is with the increasing of the gap, with the decreasing of the gap, the labor, it moves from the first stage to the second stage, and the uterine contraction, it starts increasing. Though the gap is beneficial for the baby, because when it is contracting, it causes the fetal circulation to halt or abort. Now if there is contraction, if they occur more repeatedly, of the gap is more decreased, then it will impede the blood supply of the fetal circulation. Usually analogs of the oxytocin, they are given to the patient, which are commercially available in the during the first and second stage of the labor. So what do? They causes the contraction of the uterus more and more. So if there is toxicity of, there is they are given to the patient in increased dose, it can lead to the spasm, or it can the sustained or spasmic contraction of the uterus. So if there is a spasmic contraction of the uterus, it can lead to the total blockage of the blood supply to the fetus, which can lead to the death of the fetus. So normally it is maintained with the gap because there is contraction, and then there is a period of relaxation. Whenever there is a period of relaxation, the fetus again can get the blood supply, then it leads to the contraction, at which the blood supply is halted. Then it is the third stage of the labor. It starts from the birth of the baby to the expulsion of the placenta and its membrane. At first, the placenta is separated from the endometrium. When it is separated, there is a bleeding. Though the bleeding is halted, there are some mechanisms which try to stop that bleeding. For example, vascular spasm and release of prostaglandin. But still, there is a lot of bleeding. Then there is a descent of the placenta and the cord towards the lower segment. Here you can see there is a descent, and then finally there is expulsion of the placenta with its membrane, and then uterus, it comes back to its original state. So this is how the labor is completed: first, second, and third stage of the labor. And finally there is after 4 to 5 weeks of parturition, or 4 to 5 weeks of the birth of the baby, the uterus start regressing in its size. We call this stage as the involution of the uterus. It is usually caused by the autolysis of the cells of the uterus. So and also if the mother is lactating, the involution or the regression of the uterus, its speed increases. So the finally after 4 to 5 weeks, the uterus usually comes back to its original size. Hope you guys understand this lecture. Thank you.